Mortal Enemy by Nicholas Ryan Howard. Narrated by Reed Scott, Devin Kelly, and performed by a full cast.
Part 1. Forsaken. Chapter 1. The ball of fire in the sky scorched the desert wasteland. Unrelenting heat seared the sand. A speck in the vast nothingness, like a pitiful bug, inched closer to nowhere. This speck was a man, known as Vant Hu'l. He was tall and sinewy, but ravaged, weathered, wilted by the merciless hell on earth that beat against him with all its fury. Scalding temperatures, a bitter dryness, vicious winds, the elements assaulted him without reprieve. They had all but eradicated any traces of vitality that proved this was once a vigorous young man. Vant's sandpaper tongue ran over his cracked lips, aching for a moisture long since vanished. Desperate for relief, he pulled his hood over a wiry mess of sun-charred hair. His cloak, once a flowing masterpiece of craftsmanship, was now no more than tattered rags. It dragged behind him, scraping against the sand, as he extended one decrepit boot after another in an arduous slog through the desolation. This plight was not by choice. Vant was cursed. A plague festered inside of him, one that held a relentless dominion over his volition. It appeared years ago, and its dictatorial power had escalated over time. It took hold of him, gripped his nervous system, and became his captor, his enslaver. A demented beast urging him on, stabbing at him with a branding iron if he moved in any direction other than forward. Always forward. The only way to pacify the affliction was to submit, and to trek toward an endgame that only it knew. Besides the torturous curse, Vant bore one more burden through the desert. Strapped to his back was a satchel containing an item of significance and heft. Though oppressive, he endured the encumbrance as a punishment earned. The object was a cherished trapping, and in many ways, it had come to define him. It was a weapon, the last of its kind. The wind one day died out. The sand and rolling dunes ceased, replaced by a hard-packed gravel. Stillness dominated all. An emptiness filled the environment, an absence, as if every possible shred of life had been leached dry. Nothing existed but a silence, disrupted only by the reverberations of Vant's rhythmic footsteps. The terrain, almost imperceptible, soon began a downward slope. Vant looked ahead and spied something in the distance, something unexpected, something unfathomable. In the dead center of the wasteland, surrounded by thousands of lifeless miles sprawling in every direction, was a hole like a puckered mouth. It appeared responsible for the total destitution of the surroundings, like it had sucked in everything living and left behind nothing but decay. And Vant was headed straight for it. Anxiety-fueled heartbeats slammed against his chest. The curse had, for reasons unclear, brought him to this forsaken place. Vant hoped the veil blinding him as to why he had been torn from his home, his life, and his love would at long last be lifted. Yet the closer he came to the unholy orifice, the more he was overcome by an intense foreboding. He dug in with his heels to stop his movement, and a wave of ferocious pain blasted through his physiology. The teeth of invisible demons gnashed at his nerve endings. Visceral throbbing jackhammered against his skull. Vant collapsed to the dirt and convulsed from the unendurable torment overrunning his senses. He shivered as his skin was clawed by spectral fingernails and pleaded with his body to break free from its cursed bonds. Desperate syllables of protest sputtered from his mouth. But there would be no emancipation from this terror. This was a pain beyond any, a pain that could never be endured. Vance surrendered, submitting to his Bane's assertion. He moved forward once again, headed for the very place he otherwise would never have gone. The venomous discontent, pleased with the onward momentum, subsided. Vant lowered his trembling body beneath the edge of the crevice and entered into the hole. Blackness enveloped him, his lungs filled with dust. He struggled for breath. Only his fingertips could guide him through the dark. He was gentle. Particles of sediment rained down from overhead, threatening a cave-in. His eyes adjusted, finding a hint of contour, a glimmer of detail. The blurred outlines of the interior soon came into focus and revealed a hallway running deep underground. He continued inward, downward, and entered into a chamber. Faces were carved into the walls. Mutilated faces, each sculpture a hideous rendering of torment. Hordes of the torrid statues decorated the circular tunnel. The suffering faces, though made of rock, seemed to be inhaling. Echoes of asphyxiation accompanied gusts of air flowing into their mouths. Vant took a step inside and felt a dreadful texture underneath his boot. It was coarse, cracking beneath his weight and crumbling into dust. He looked down. He had stepped upon a pit of dried-out bodies. Ancient corpses, hundreds of them, were decaying in a mass grave. Sounds of desecration echoed through the tunnel as Vant traversed the pit. The sculpted faces now surrounded him, inhaling deeper and harder the farther he went. Their gasps grew increasingly aggressive, then turned desperate when he did not suffer the same fate as had the deceased beneath his feet. But after the last few steps, and to the wheezing dismay of the sculptures, Vant made it to the end of the tunnel, alive and breathing. He descended an incline and entered into a cavern. A horizontal vertigo took hold as he peered down a seemingly endless corridor. The interior was rugged, the ground uneven. Stalagmites and stalactites jutted from its claustrophobic walls. The passageway stretched on with no exit in sight. The more Vant progressed, the more jagged the rock protrusions became. Their edges seemed to grow finer, their tips sharper. In a moment of carelessness, Vant's arm grazed against one of the stalagmites. At first, he thought it was nothing, just a scratch. But on closer examination, it had cut an inch-deep slit in his flesh. He cradled his arm and backed away. Another stone dragged against his calf. It opened a flap of skin on his leg. Vant cursed under his breath, but quickly froze his movements. He assessed his predicament. The outcroppings were surrounding him, pointing at him. He was ensnared, tangled up in a bizarre limbo. He searched for stable footing, but lacked dexterity due to his depleted physical condition. He wanted nothing more than to back away, knowing further movement into the maze of razor-sharp rock would be insane. But the curse would not let him retreat. With no choice, he pressed on. His cloak and satchel repeatedly snagged stone tips, throwing off his balance. Each step resulted in an additional slash, gash, and slice of the skin. A sound filled the cavern. A trickle, like water into a basin. Vant's stomach lurched with the realization that it originated from him. Blood from his lacerations was dribbling onto the floor. He contorted himself, attempting to ingress. Each movement was a desperate exercise in discipline. His strength waned. His muscles burned. His mind clouded. Consciousness was slipping away. He scanned every direction, but the intertwining of jagged rocks blocked every conceivable path through. Yet, one option remained. Vant navigated his hands behind his lower back. He dared not move his head. Several spikes tickled his hair and ears, threatening impalement. He maneuvered his shaking fingers into his satchel, then into a pair of oversized gauntlets. He grabbed hold of them, but forced suppression of the sigh of relief that wished to follow. Inflating his lungs would have meant a punctured chest. Donning the fist-shaped iron gloves, a flicker of strength reappeared inside him, a nostalgic euphoria of power. He flipped hidden ignition switches inside the handholds. The weapons roared to life. Flashes illuminated the cavern from the pebble-sized turbines lining the armaments. A melodic pulsing of power cells accompanied the thrusters as they rotated in sync with the embedded gyroscopes. The stabilizers and propulsion systems worked in tandem to make the heft of the gauntlets inordinately light. Vance steadied himself, then shoved his weight forward. The knuckles of the weapons shattered the nearest spikes. He whittled himself enough space to adjust his body, then pulverized another set of spikes, and another, and another. Vant reveled in the destruction. After so many years of restraint, to let loose again felt sublime. He drank in the catharsis and freed himself from ensnarement by carving a path through the passage. At long last, he found a small opening and dove into the crevice. On the other side, the terrain gave out. He tumbled further into the unknown, into a darkness so thick he could feel it against his skin. He huffed for oxygen, but breath eluded him. The air was impossibly thin. Vant righted himself and walked. He heard no footfalls. The void was suppressing all acoustics. This place was something unnatural, ghostly, a stronghold of shadow. He ambled on. The inky nothingness proved near impossible to navigate. His attempts to discern direction were useless. There were no landmarks, no echoes to serve as makeshift sonar, no marks in the ground, and no tracks to follow. His only guide was his gut, which he second-guessed with every step. His intuition turned on him, arguing that going straight was somehow incorrect. It would be so much better to pivot left or right. With apprehension, Vant relented. He turned, but did he make a quarter turn? Or a full one? Was he now moving forward? With the modification, was he now further off course? All the while, he leaked blood. This had become a race to find the finish before his wounds emptied his precious life force into the dirt. His mind spun. His wits were abandoning him. He was losing himself in the black. He scoured his brain for an explanation for this, and for all he had experienced within the catacombs. He reflected.
A hallway that siphons life, a cavern of spikes, a labyrinth of blackness. These are more than devilish traps. They're mysteries to be solved.
Vant halted with a revelation. Winding left or right brought no response from the curse. He could turn again. This had to be a piece of the puzzle. Had to be. A riddle of hypothetical nature emerged in his mind.
If asked to design the most vindictive maze imaginable, where would the endpoint be?
He pondered.
Of course. At the start.
He did a swift turnaround, and sure enough, a shape materialized in the distance. He walked on. The mass became larger and more pronounced. It was a face? Deep shadows resembled eye sockets, and highlights accented a nose. It was a face. The face of an ominous monolith rising into the blackness above. As he moved closer to the solemn visage, it revealed its massive dimensions and its purpose. The monument was a gate, and its open mouth a doorway. Vant had found the end of the labyrinth. He glimpsed what was on the other side. Such perfect oblivion. Yet in the furthest reaches of the emptiness, something stirred. Something tiny. Something white. A meteor-like mass impacted with the ground in front of Vant. He scrambled away, wrestling to control his adrenaline. He rose, gathered himself, and took in what blocked his path. A hulking figure composed of stone. No, not stone. Bone. The beast lumbered toward Vant. It moved as if awakened from eons of slumber.
Whoa, what are you?
In his long life, he had seen his fair share of the bizarre, but nothing like this. Nothing he would categorize as supernatural. The golem hobbled like an overgrown child. Its face, same as the monument, was devoid of expression. Any notion that this creature was a manifestation from delirium faded when it reached out its pillar-like arms to strike. Particles of debris wafted across Vant's face as he evaded. He tried to reason with it.
Listen, I mean you no harm.
Boulder-like hands struck ground. As Vant leapt aside, a sad, guttural moan came from the creature's innards.
Calm down. Take a breath.
Vant had no idea if it even could. It gave no indication of comprehending his words. And instead, it took another swipe, this time twice as angry and with double the force.
Listen, fella, I've never beaten up a whatever it is that you are, but I will damn well start today.
It plodded on, preparing again to attack. It had one clear purpose: flatten the intruder. Vant raised his iron fists, then jolted them downward. Two steel whips uncoiled from the knuckles of each gauntlet. Their tips stung the ground, creating a shockwave of reverberation. He squared off with the golem, taunted it, flicked the lashes of his whips, which licked the dirt with a mesmerizing crackle. Combat was nothing new to Vant. He had taken apart his fair share of foes with his whip gauntlets, but a creature made of bone?
There's a first for everything,
Vant thought. The brute charged. Vant took a well-timed dive to the side and flicked his right wrist. A whip skimmed the soil and locked around the leg of the beast. He pulled the slack taut, yanking its footing out. The creature collapsed. Vant jumped onto its torso. He pushed the propulsion in his weapons to pound at the golem. Its body split apart until nothing was left but a cloud of particles floating over bony rubble. Vant blew dust off the knuckles of his gauntlets. The corner of his mouth threatened to let slip a grin. In the heat of battle, a long-lost brashness had returned. But within the eye sockets of the monument, viscous clumps of bone built up like tears. Another grumpy moan came from the formation, and another. The formations grew and grew until they dropped, touching down in front of the effigy's entrance. Two more golems. Both charged. Vant slid between them. He flung his whips backward at the beasts and felt the tension twist around their midsections. He shoved his hands forward. The torque lifted the golems off their feet. They collided mid-air in a satisfying explosion of debris.
I could do this all day.
But he choked on his words. 4 more golems dripped from the monument's eyes. Vant smashed, dodged, fought the beasts with a combination of whip work and power thrusts. But with every skirmish won, his strength waned. And with every destroyed opponent, twice as many appeared.
Another riddle?
The Guardian's swarm was relentless. He had to regroup, had to get some tactical distance. After avoiding a boulder-like fist swinging past his head, Vant sprinted away from the monument. But his body involuntarily jackknifed. The curse would not let him retreat. It clenched his muscular system in its claws and squeezed. The agony brought Vant to his knees. He saw it coming, but there was nothing he could do. A golem's fist collided with his chest. The blow hurled him backwards, sending him farther from the monument. The curse became enraged. Every fiber in Vant's nervous system exploded from its wrath. He hollered out in anguish. Vant wrestled to his feet. Dozens of adversaries blocked his path. The last thing he wanted was to move closer to the creatures, but the vehemence of his affliction was too oppressive to endure. He had no choice. He had to go through them. He spat out a few choice obscenities, took a deep breath, and forced himself toward the effigy's open mouth, He pushed his gauntlets to their limits and shattered several golems, but more appeared in their stead. He darted into the mob. The gate was in his sights. He juked around a beast. He faked out another. The monument grew near. 2 golems lunged. He avoided them, but in doing so, he cut an angle too close to a throng of enemies lurking at his side. Vant suffered a fist to the ribs, a snapped leg, an inverted elbow, a headbutt. He fell. They dogpiled. He lay limp on the floor. His spine was bent in a zigzag. Bodily fluids pooled underneath his mangled limbs. His one good eye, the other was bashed in, tried to see something, anything, inside the mouth of the effigy. Vant knew it was the solution to the puzzle, the answer to all the twisted riddles, the explanation for the cavern, of his forced march through the wasteland, and of his bastard curse. He had to know what lay beyond the gate. He had to. Inside, there was a glowing particle of purest white. Vant heard a sound, ever so subtle, like the shifting of weight. Then, the illumination seemed to move and grow. Heavy footfalls displaced gravel. The bone guardians, penitent and frightened, retreated. The white grew larger and larger. Whatever it was, it took its time. The footsteps grew louder as it drew closer. And then, that which dwelled in the dark made itself known. The white was a mask with the same expressionless face of the monument and of the bone golems. The owner of the guise had the shape of a human, albeit a colossal one. Beneath a hooded cape, its body was wrapped in layers of fabric, secured by tourniquet-tight straps. The living form inside was bound and sealed, with not a shred of skin exposed. The figure crouched. It prodded Vant's disfigured body in a violating evaluation. Vant tried to speak, but failed. He managed only a fleshy lip smack. The being rose, decisive. It kicked Vant's weapons out of his hands. He felt the crush of emasculation as his whip gauntlets tumbled across the dirt. Stripped of them, and all they represented, a solitary tear ran down the tip of his busted nose. Vant tried to mouth the words, "Who are you?" But nothing close came out. Yet the figure nodded, knowingly. And then, it spoke. The voice was raw, as if unused for the last eternity.
"Who am I?"
Vant wanted to know. "Please," he emoted. It shook its massive head. Futility seized Vant at his core. He tried again to mouth the phrase.
"What am I?"
Vant nodded. A terrifyingly beautiful resounding filled the space. The ringing of a perfectly sharpened blade separating from a sheath. The being answered,
"Death."
A scythe sliced through the air. It cut through Vant's neck. He felt the ripping sensation of becoming untethered. His head rolled across the floor.